Hey guys, welcome back to mographplus.com, and in this lesson we are going to be creating a realistic jade shader. So we're going to be focusing on this example and trying to create something like this, and in combination with something like this. So we'll be trying to mix and match and come up with something that can be called a realistic jade shader, right? So obviously, in the diffuse color and also the subsurface scattering color, obviously jade is translucent. So we're going to be using the same map for our diffuse color and for our subsurface scattering color. But as you can see, our diffuse color also has some elements, for example, like these bright points, like these darker points, that are not in the subsurface scattering color. So in these points that our diffuse color is obviously separated from our subsurface scattering color, we need to also control our subsurface scattering weight. So in these parts there would be no subsurface scattering weight, or it would be less than the other parts of the shader. As you can see, the reflections are very sharp, but they are, as you can see, distorted and uneven. We need to take that into consideration. Also, we have some level of bump mapping. Let's go ahead and get started. I mean, I'm not gonna be try to make exactly this or exactly this. I will be trying to take some elements from this one and some elements from this one and come up with a beautiful shader at the end. But because we don't have the exact same shapes, it would be very hard to get the exact same sense and feeling. So let's go ahead and get started. Just put these images aside here. So that's the scene that we are having. As you can see, it's a very simple scene: one camera, one dragon model. So let's create our standard shader and let's name it Jade. And as you can see, I have these tag here, this texture tag, and its projection set to frontal. And obviously I'm cheating in the UV mapping, and the frontal isn't something that I recommend, but in this case, when we have a lot of high frequency details and no specific pattern in our shader, it would be very hard to actually see any problem with the frontal projection. So it's easier, and this object doesn't have a great UV, so I'm using frontal projection, even though, as I mentioned, it's cheating, but it's going to work for us. So let me just apply it on this tag. And also I have a normal parameter tag, just set the cat Clark to about 2, so we have a smoother shape. Perfect. Let's open up our standard shader, and I can run the IPR at the same time. Okay. So obviously we're going to be controlling our diffuse color and subsurface scattering color with a map, but for the time being, let's use one of these green colors that I have here, and let's increase our diffuse weight to something like 0.75 maybe. Add some specular weight, GGX, turn on Fresnel, use IR, and in this case I used an IR like 2. And for the subsurface scattering, obviously we're going to be making about 1, and let's use a color like this. Change the diffusion profile to empirical, and the radius, that's, it really depends on you. If you go to, for example, something like 30 here, you can see the subsurface scattering much more obviously. For example, in this part, if you wait a bit, but I think I don't want to make it that obvious. You can see the scattering effect here, so I use something like 8 centimeter, and we can change it if needs be. Okay, so that's about our basic shader, and it can be a bit more reflective. And there you have it. Now let's create our first layer color. Okay, that's going to be controlling both our diffuse color and our subsurface scattering color. Now it's black, as you can see, because our first layer is black and the alpha set to 1. So for the first layer, I'll be using a mix node and try to set the first input to a green color like 44, 93, and 34. And the second color 93, 154, and 60. So we have these two colors and we're going to be combining them and using them as our base colors. So that's going to be our layer 1. And for the mix amount, let's use an image node, which is going to be bigger. So BW38, this blurred version. And if you connect this directly here, you can see the result, which is good. So that's going to be our mix amount, and that's going to be our first layer, right? Now, for the second layer, let me select my layer color node and use a simple color this time. And what I'm gonna be adding is just add some color variation, add some, you can see some parts are a bit brighter, or you can see in this example, if I can show it to you here, you can see some parts are, you can see a bit brighter compared to the base here, for example. So we'll be trying to add some of that in our second layer. So for the second layer, we're going to be using a brighter color like 144, 181, and 118. So as you can see, it's a brighter green compared to what we use in our first mix color. And for its alpha, let's use another image, which this time is going to be BW, I think I used this one, BW33. And if I connect it here, that's good. So that's going to be controlling our layer 2 alpha, right? And now the result is going to be like this. Obviously this is just way too bright, and I think if you can invert the image so this brighter part will only show in these smaller areas compared to what we have, which this green, this brighter green is showing up in the majority of our surface. So if I use a ramp floats node again, after this image, first of all, if we invert it, you can see now we see it in smaller regions. And if I see my whole standard shader, let's just render this part here. I don't want those brighter parts. As you can see right now, they're very effective, right? And I really don't want it to be like that. We're just adding some imperfections here. So let me just go to something like 0.5 for my brighter values, so they wouldn't be that effective. Okay, so as you can see now, they are not that effective, but they are there. So let's see what we are gonna get if we see some parts of our IPR. So that's what we are having in our IPR, and as you can see, this is the combination of these two layers for the time being. Our first layer, which is this mix node, and our second layer, which is this brighter color. And for the third layer, what I want to add is just adding some of these brighter spots that you can see on this surface but I don't want to make them that effective and that obvious because of the object that you're having. It's not going to be looking that great like this symmetrical surface that you're having here. So let me just add some of that. Now for the third layer, the color I'm going to be using is going to be, let me just, as I mentioned earlier, it's very simple. You can simply sample one of these colors, right? So just go here and open up the color and sample from that image, right? So for me, just to make the process a bit easier, I have some colors, which is 154, 189, and 142. So as you can see, bright green color, and it's very close to this one. And for its alpha, so let's just see. Let's start with another image, and the image we are going to be using is this new image, which is BW52. Okay, and if I run the IPR and connect this, we should be able to see how it's looking. So that's what we're having. Obviously this is way too much, and what I'm going to be doing is to multiply this with another image so it wouldn't be all over the place. So let's multiply it with something patchy, maybe like this one. So that's going to be our first layer, and that's going to be our second layer. And if I connect this now, as you can see, it's not that crazy all over the place, and this image is controlling it. So it would be less effective in some places and more effective in some places. But the image we're using isn't that great. We want to add a bit more imperfections. So what I want to do is use another layer color in between here and use this image as my first layer, and load another image with some spots and bright points. So something like this, and I'm going to be using this as my second layer. Okay, so that's going to be our layer 2, and if I connect this, increase this, we can use lighten here. Now we see both of these colors, and what I can do is to use this as my layer 3 alpha. Okay, and now you should be able to see these bright points all over the place, but I think the effect is going to be just way too much if we connect our standard shader. And let's see a place like this maybe, or I think these white points are just way too much right now, and I don't want to make the shader that messy. So let's use a RAM float node after this first layer color, which is basically this one, and let me see how it works. Let's go to something like maybe 0.5 ish would work, and let's see what you're gonna get, and if there's anything to be changed, we're gonna come back and change it. So let me just connect my standard shader using Control Shift V and see what you're gonna get. Okay, so I think we made a mistake because these bright spots are just way too bright. Yeah, we haven't actually connected the RAM float node here. So let me use this map and not this one that is right now connected, and as you can see it's way too bright. And let's see if we can actually select this image, which is the second layer here, and maybe add some repetition so it wouldn't be, I don't know, I think that's going to be a bit better. And let's use this RAM float as our layer 3 alpha here. And connect this standard shader again and see what we are gonna get this time. And that's our layer 3 alpha here. Okay folks, so that's our IPR here, and as you can see we have these slightly brighter spots all over our shader, which is exactly what we want. We don't want to make it that obvious in this case. Now another thing I want to add is just adding some of these darker spots here and there. You can see some of these darker spots compared to the rest, and let me just do that. Okay, so if I open up the shader and let me start with a mix node. So that's our first mix node, and let me use a dark green like this, and that's going to be our first input. For our second input, let's use something like 62 and 28. So okay, and again use another image here, insert before as the mix amount, and that's going to be, doesn't matter really specifically here, so I may use something like this. So if I run the IPR, we're gonna get something like this. Now I want to also have another mix node, so we'll be combining about 4 colors in this layer. So it's gonna be 31, 34, and 30, very dark, and 44, 44, 57, and 40. So simply sampling color from these darker spots of this image reference here, right? And for their mix amount, let's use something patchy here. Now we have 4 colors and we want to mix them again, and this time the first mix is going to be our input 1. Let's see, so that's our first input, that's our second input, and for the mix amount let's use another image, and this time I'll use, I think it was BW32. I think we have used this image previously, so let me just offset it a tad so it wouldn't be exactly where the previous image was. So something like this, doesn't have to be anything specific, and that's going to be our mix amount. Let me connect that, and now we're gonna get a combination of those 4 colors, right, which is good. And for this layer alpha, so that's basically our layer 4, So let me just save this. And for this alpha, let's start with, so for the first layer, something with some bright spots. I think this can work. So this is our first layer. Let me, if we can offset it, something like this, and it will be also used in a layer color. So that's our first layer. For the second layer, I'm just going to use the same image here, but change its placement. So what you can do is simply use a UV transform node, okay, and as the path through, and that's going to be our layer 2. And simply, if I connect this one and increase layer 2 and change its blending mode to lighten, now these two layers are the exact same thing, right? So this is our first layer and this is our second layer. But what I can do is to rotate this one a tad. So let's see. So now we have two different placements. This is the first one and this is the second one, and together we're going to get this combination, right? And let's see if we use this as our layer 4 alpha. I think this is going to be, let me just put a RAM float node in between in case we need that. So that's our input, and this is going to be our layer 4 alpha here. So the combination, if I connect this layer color node to the input, we should get something like this. You see these brighter spots, these darker spots here and there. I really don't want this layer to be working like this. I just want it to be adding a bit more imperfections, general imperfection, not these very specific points here. So let me just add another layer here. We possibly don't need this first two layer, but if I use another image node and let's see, use something like maybe this one. If I connect that, you just increase the shin. And if I use a color correct node to just darken the image and add some contrast, something like this, and use this as the layer 3, right? So now we get this, change the mode obviously to lighten. So if we, can decrease this layer to something maybe like this, so it wouldn't be that effective, right? And I don't know, this one also really decreased, so maybe something like this can work. Okay, let's go for this. So that's basically, I think we're done with the diffuse color and subsurface scattering color, even though we're going to be now working on a diffuse color a bit more, but for the subsurface scattering color we're possibly done. So let's see the entire shader and I'll be back. Okay, so that's what we are having right now, and I'm quite happy with this. Now what I'm going to be doing right now is to just try to adjust the diffuse color a bit more. You can see in some of these parts you see a bit more these darker spots. For example, you can see the diffuse contribution is a bit more and the subsurface scattering is a bit less, and we can add that to our diffuse color. Also you can see this parts, this brighter dirtier parts in some parts, and also some of these bright spots here and there. So we're going to be adding this to, or you can see throughout the shader, so we're going to be adding this to our diffuse color, and at the same time we'll be trying to make sure that the subsurface scattering weight in these parts are going to be less compared to the rest of the shader. Okay, so let's get started doing that. So now if I just make this a bit bigger, let me just adjust these nodes a bit. So that's our standard shader. And for the diffuse color, I'm going to be using another layer color node. Now the first layer is going to be this whole thing that we have been creating in this lesson. So this is going to be our first layer, right? And this is going to be controlling our diffuse color. Let me just make a bit more space so we can adjust the diffuse color map a bit easier. Now for the first layer, I'm going to be adding some of these darker spots, but I don't want to make them that obvious and effective like what we have here. Just some darker spots, slightly darker spots on the diffuse. Okay, so let's use a mix node again and try to, let me just get closer. So the first color, which is going to be dark, is going to be 45, 57, and 27. And the second color, 29, 35, and 19. And for the mix amount, insert before as the mix. We're going to be using something like, it really doesn't have to be anything specific. Let's see, maybe this. And so as you can see, it's very dark. So that's going to be our second layer. And for its alpha, let's use something with some bright spots. I mean, we can use something like this and then invert the image. So right now this is what we're gonna get, and these darker spots are gonna be appearing through this wider section of this image. So we will need to use a complement node to invert the image. So there we go. And let's use a ramp float node after this if we need to adjust the visibility of this layer. So that's going to be our layer 2 alpha, right? Layer 2 alpha. And if I connect this, you see these very dark spots, but as I mentioned, I really don't want them to be that dark. So let's decrease the bright parts of the alpha. So you can see maybe just a bit brighter. So something like this. Okay, so now we have these darker spots. So that's our first layer. For the second layer, what I'll be adding is just some of these dirt and you know, some of these brighter parts, but they shouldn't be that effective really. Let's add that. We're just trying to add as much as detail as we can. So let's use some slightly brighter colors. So 163, 175, and 143. And for the second color, and you can sample from the image if you want to, so 103. Okay. Let's use another image to control the mix amount. Sorry. Insert before as the mix amount. And let's use something like, again, this is a nice map, but let me go ahead and just offset it a tad so it wouldn't be maybe something like this would be nice. I think we use this image in our network, so that's why I actually try to offset it, because if you're using the same map in a few places to control different things, they're gonna, you know, overlay and stay on top of each other. So it's a good idea to actually try and offset if you are using the same map so you get different results. So if I connect this mix map, that's what we're having, and that's going to be our layer 3 here. And for the layer 3 alpha, let's this time use something that can be very patchy, I think. I mean, this is very close to what we really want. Okay, connect that. So let me just increase the scale here. And also I think we have used this image, so let me just offset it maybe to something like this. And also we can use our ramp float node to control how visible this layer is going to be. So insert after input, and that's going to be our layer 3 alpha, right? So layer 3 alpha, and if I connect these guys, you can see we see these brighter spots all over the place, but maybe I just want to make sure they are not that effective. So let's go to something like maybe 0.7. Whoa, what the hell happened here? So select the point and change the point Y to something like maybe 0.7. And if you decrease it completely, you can see this layer will disappear. And if you increase the contrast, you can see it will be a lot more effective. So maybe this isn't actually too bad. Something like this will be possibly enough. And let's just add some of these brighter spots that you can see throughout the shader. I'm still thinking maybe 0.5 for this, something like this. Okay, now for the fourth layer, which is going to be those brighter spots, let me just use a simple color, 181, 189, and 173. So as you can see, very bright color. And For its alpha, let's use a simple image here, which is going to be something with some bright spots. Maybe that's what we want really. And if I connect this directly, obviously, let's use a RAM float node here. But before that, possibly we can just increase its scale. So the points would get smaller and all over the place. And again, a RAM float, insert after, whoa. So insert after input, reset, invert, and let me just add some contrast because those spots are very visible, even though small. So maybe something like this, and that's going to be our layer for alpha. Okay, so now if I connect this one, you can see this is the result that we are having, these very bright spots all over the place. I don't know, is it too much? Maybe this last layer is a bit too, maybe too much really. Or what we can do, what if we increase this to something like maybe 4 and 4, just so those points would get smaller. Maybe that's a better idea. I don't know. Let's actually see. So that's what we are having right now, right? Let me just connect the standard shader and see what we're gonna get. I'm going to be saving this and I'll be back to see where we are. Okay, so that's our render, and if I compare it to our previous render, you can see now we have added these brighter spots and some of these darker spots, and okay, so you can see some of these changes in the diffuse color. Now what I want to do is to just go ahead and make sure that the subsurface scattering weight is going to be a little bit less compared to the other part. So in this part that we are affecting by our 3 new diffuse color layer, we're just going to be decreasing the subsurface scattering weight. So if I create another layer color here, okay, which is going to be just a combination of these layers, so layer 2 alpha, layer 3 alpha, and layer 4 alpha here. So let's see, let me just maybe use this one instead of the RAM float node. So okay, that's our layer 3 alpha. Let's use it as our second layer, and that's our layer 4 alpha, and let's use it as our layer 3. So right now that's the map that we're having, and if I run the IPR, our first layer, our second layer, and our third layer. Now we obviously need to change these 2 upper layer to something like lighten. So lighten and lighten. We also change this layer for nothing. So let's get back to normal. And Now what I want to do, obviously right now the subsurface scattering weight will be more in these parts, and we want the opposite effect. So if I use a RAM float node, so that's the RAM float node, insert after input, we just want to go ahead and invert the image. So right now the specular weight will be 1 in other parts, and in these darker parts it would be less, but I really don't want it to be that contrasty. So what I'm going to do is to just increase the darker parts, so those parts that are being controlled by our diffuse color here be just are gonna have a less specular weight, subsurface scattering weight compared to the rest. So maybe something like this. And let me also just control these layers a bit for the time being, so we can see what's going on. So okay, so let's see. This is our first layer. Our second layer. And our third layer. Maybe something like this. And as I mentioned, let's decrease the contrast, maybe to something like this. And now this is going to be controlling our subsurface scattering weights. So let's connect that to our subsurface scattering weight and see what we are going to get. Okay, so that's what we're having, and it doesn't have to be that effective really. We're just trying to add some little details here and there to make the shader a bit more realistic. Maybe these white spots are just a bit maybe too much really, but let's just see what we're going to have in the entire IPR, and I'll be back just to work on the specular weight and roughness and add some unevenness to them too. So that's the render that we are having, and if I compare it to our previous render, you can see basically what we have done. You can see, for example, these darker spots, the subsurface scattering weight is less, and we see more of the diffuse contribution. But what I really don't like about this render, I think the white spots are just a bit too much. So let's see, maybe the color is too bright, or just let's just try and maybe let's render these parts here and see what we can do. The layer that controls these white spots, I think, is this layer 4 here. And let's see if I connect this directly and run the IPR. Let me just make them to be less effective, and now hopefully we should have better results if I connect this. Let me just maybe render this part here. And see if we need to change anything. As you can see, they are less effective compared to what we had before. And also in here, we can possibly decrease how much they affect the specular weight, the subsurface scattering weight, sorry. Okay. This is looking like to be better. Let's render these spots. Okay, so let me just see what we're gonna have. Okay folks, so that's what we have, and as you can see now the subsurface scattering weight is a bit more uneven compared to what we had before, and also these bright spots here and there are just less effective compared to the previous render, and I think this one is a bit nicer. Now for the specular weight and specular roughness, I'm just going to add some general unevenness. Really, it doesn't have to be anything special, and it doesn't have to be too much. So let's start with our specular weights. Load an image node here. So that's here. So for the specular weight, let's start by something like this. And if I run the IPR and connect this, and let's see what we have and if we need to change anything here. Let's change the scale UNV to something like 2 and maybe just offset it a bit in case we've used this map before. Something like that. Okay, and just right now the specular weight is about 0.15, 0.2 maybe. And let me use a RAM float after this image, insert after. So insert after input, and let's see. We don't want any part to be very, very reflective. And also we don't want any part to be not reflective at all. So maybe something like this can work. Okay. And for the specular roughness, the same thing. So maybe we can duplicate these two nodes, and for the specular roughness, let me use this one and connect it here. So there we go. Let me just change the scale values back to before. Now, as you can see, the majority of our surface will be very rough, so that's why we possibly need to go ahead and actually invert this. So let's see. Maybe something like this. So as you can see, some parts are going to be sharper compared to the other parts, but the contrast isn't that much. And that is going to be our so this is the specular weight, our first one, and this is the specular roughness. Okay. And now for the bump map, I really don't want to make a very visible bump map, something very, very small, maybe just to make some of these reflections a bit uneven. So what we can do here, let me use a bump here. So that's the shader, and for the map here, if we use another image node here, let's see. So maybe something like this. Let's with scale set to something like 2 here, so we get a bit more detail. and this is going to be our bump map. And if I connect the bump map directly, obviously I've worked with the shader, as you can see, one is way too much, and the value that I'm going to be using is 001. It's not going to be that visible at all, and it's just going to affect the reflections a tad. So that's basically our network. And as you can see, now we have some unevenness in the specular weight and the specular roughness, but it's not that contrasty and that visible. So so that's what we're having, as you can see. What I'm going to do is to save this and actually maybe stop the IPR and prepare ourselves with a final render. Maybe I actually render another version of this shader with another color. So, but for the time being, if let's go to something like 2000 for the render, and the subsurface scattering, something like 4 is going to be enough, and the diffuse maybe something like 5, glossy samples can be something like 3, and the camera samples maybe we can increase them to 4, but I think that's just too much. So that's about it. I'm going to start a render, and I'll be back when the render is finished. Okay guys, so the render is finished, and as you can see, we get this beautiful detailed jade shader, and I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot. There you have it. Perfect. And I just did some very basic color correction in Photoshop, and as you can see, they're not perfect because I actually didn't have the reflection paths to work with. I forgot to render that, so as you can see, the color is a bit different here. That's why we get a bit weird renders, but as you can see, simply you can color correct it in Photoshop or in After Effects and get different results. Okay, so that's about it, and I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot, and I will see you in the next lesson.